Frieza, the Galactic Tyrant from Dragon Ball Z, is one of the most iconic and feared characters in anime history. But have you ever stopped to wonder what truly lies beneath his ruthless coldness and relentless thirst for absolute control? He's far more than a typical villain. His personality hides complex psychological layers. Behind that cruel exterior, there's a figure shaped by fears and power strategies that challenge simple understanding. In this video, we'll dive deep into what makes Frieza such a dominant leader while revealing his inner struggles. We'll explore the narcissistic traits that fuel his ego, the emotional coldness that distances him from others, and the deep-rooted fear that drives his endless quest for control. Get ready to journey beyond battles and into the mind of a character who embodies one of the most intricate facets of power and human psychology. Will you ever see Frieza the same way again? His story might reveal much about what happens when fear and ambition intertwine, and how that shapes not only an empire, but the very mind of its ruler. Frieza's story begins long before the epic battles and destruction we know. He was born into a context where power isn't just desired. It is demanded for survival. His galactic empire functions as a machine of control and hierarchy, where every gesture and decision is calculated to maintain order and guarantee supremacy. This environment doesn't just produce a ruler, it produces someone who learns from an early age that showing weakness means losing everything. In this sense, Frieza is not cruel by nature. He is the product of a system that values absolute domination and emotional detachment as signs of strength. His personality reveals intense narcissism. He sees himself as the center of the universe, deserving of worship and unquestioned respect. What many don't realize is that this narcissism is actually a constructed facade designed to mask deep insecurities. Behind that arrogant smile and calm voice lies an individual terrified of losing control, not just over others, but over himself. Psychologically, this fear can be understood as a control anxiety, a state where one feels their world might collapse if they don't to keep a firm grip on the reins. Moreover, Frieza's emotional coldness acts as a protective barrier. It isolates him from suffering, empathy, and doubt, elements he associates with weakness. This emotional dissociation is a real psychological mechanism, often used by people under extreme pressure to keep functioning without becoming overwhelmed. Within the Empire's harsh environment, Frieza begins to forge his identity not only as a leader, but as a symbol of relentless power. Every action is part of this puzzle, eliminating threats before they even emerge, displaying strength without hesitation, and maintaining tight control over his subordinates. All of this creates an atmosphere of fear and respect where his image is unchallengeable. However, this absolute control, while appearing solid, conceals vulnerabilities few dare to notice. What many see as sheer cruelty is, in fact, the outward expression of an individual struggling to maintain emotional stability. This silent, ongoing battle is what makes Frieza such a complex figure. But there was something no one saw coming, an invisible shift, slow yet decisive, beginning to shape who he truly was about to become. Every powerful figure, no matter how invincible they seem, encounters a defining moment that shakes the very foundation of their identity. For Frieza, this pivotal moment came as a serious challenge to his authority and an unsettling threat to his feeling of invulnerability. It was a turning point not only in his external rule but deep within his psyche, moment when his carefully constructed world began to show cracks. This rupture created an intense internal conflict. On one side, the grand, all-powerful image Frieza projected to the galaxy. On the other, the hidden vulnerabilities and doubts that had long been suppressed beneath his icy exterior. Psychologists describe such a moment as a crisis of control, where the individual faces the terrifying possibility of losing their grip over their environment and, by extension, over themselves. In response, Frieza developed what experts call defensive fixation, a psychological defense mechanism where the person doubles down on their rigid worldview to protect themselves from emotional discomfort and uncertainty. For him, this meant becoming even more relentless in his pursuit of dominance, rejecting any sign of weakness or failure as intolerable. Externally, this defensive reaction manifested as escalating displays of power and control. Frieza's actions became more extreme, his punishments harsher, and his leadership increasingly ruthless. Paradoxically, this was not simply a matter of cruelty. Rather, it was an adaptive strategy designed to mask his inner turmoil and reassert his shaken sense of order. The psychological tension inside Frieza grew as his need for control collided with the unpredictable realities around him. This struggle reflects what scientists call the fear of loss of control, a powerful motivator behind many rigid and aggressive behaviors. Frieza's external aggression, then, was a mirror of his internal chaos, a desperate attempt to stabilize a world that felt increasingly unstable. This period also added complexity to his personality. Alongside his narcissistic confidence and self-importance, a new trait took root, a deep intolerance for failure and vulnerability. Every threat, no matter how small, was now magnified as a potential unraveling of his identity and authority. This shift also impacted his relationships with others. Subordinates who might once have been tolerated now faced harsher scrutiny. Alliances were tested and broken more quickly. Frieza's world became a pressure cooker, where trust was scarce and suspicion reigned. The isolation that comes with such paranoia only deepened his emotional coldness, making him more distant and less able to connect, even to those closest to him. From a broader psychological perspective, Frieza's transformation illustrates a pattern observed in many leaders who face crises. When their sense of control is threatened, they respond with rigid, extreme behaviors to protect their core identity. This cycle often leads to escalating conflict and further alienation. And it was precisely at this fragile and unstable moment that the true unraveling began a slow, inevitable descent that would reshape everything he thought he was. As Frieza's internal world shifted, so did the structure of his mind. The turbulence and tension gave way to a cold, calculated resolve, one that shaped a new way of thinking and acting. This was no longer the impulsive or reactive tyrant of earlier times. Frieza became a master strategist, his mind a fortress of ruthless logic and emotional detachment. To understand this evolution, we must step inside his thoughts. Frieza's worldview hardened, seeing people less as individuals and more as tools or obstacles. Empathy, a feeling that might soften a heart or encourage mercy, was systematically eliminated from his decision-making. Instead, he adopted a mindset where efficiency and control were paramount, and any emotional distraction was a liability. Psychologists recognize such shifts as aspects of dissociative adaptation, where a person distances themselves from emotions to better execute challenging or morally complex decisions. In Frieza's case, this meant suppressing any trace of compassion in favor of cold calculation. Several key moments reveal this transformation. His methodical elimination of threats, whether entire planets or individuals, was not an act of blind rage, but a carefully orchestrated tactic to maintain supremacy. His cold, measured voice often masked an underlying psychological strategy. By instilling fear and uncertainty, he maintained control not only through power, but through psychological dominance. This evolution parallels concepts studied in behavioral science and leadership psychology. Frieza's control tactics resemble those of authoritarian leaders who rely on fear and strict discipline to manage their followers. The consistency and predictability of his cruelty became tools of psychological warfare, designed to keep others in a state of submission. Furthermore, scientific studies on power reveal how individuals in dominant positions often develop cognitive patterns that reinforce their perceived superiority. Frieza's belief in his invincibility was both a cause and effect of his behavior, a feedback loop that made him increasingly isolated and extreme. Yet, Within this calculated exterior, there were signs of an even darker potential, something dormant, waiting to emerge. The disciplined mind could still harbor impulses far more destructive than those already displayed. This hinted at a deeper, more dangerous evolution on the horizon. The structured darkness of Frieza's mind was not just a survival mechanism. It was the foundation of a new form of power, one that combined intellect with intimidation. But the true force he would become was still hidden beneath the surface. The sky over Derry turned a shade darker as night approached, draping the town in unsettling silence. Fred and Daphne found themselves inside the now abandoned town library, where cobwebs lined the spines of forgotten books, and the faint scent of mildew clung to the air. They held flashlights, their beams cutting through the dimness as they tiptoed across the creaking floorboards. In a hidden alcove behind a fallen bookshelf, they uncovered a journal, cracked leather, initials BK. The same name that matched a child who vanished in 1958. Every few decades. The same pattern, Daphne murmured. Fred opened the journal, and his hands trembled as the pages revealed illustrations of a red balloon drifting toward a sewer and scribbled entries. He comes when the moon is gone. He talks like a friend, but he's not. A shiver passed between them. Daph, this thing, whatever it is, it's been here for generations. The walls around them groaned, as if reacting to the truth finally being read aloud. Meanwhile, in a dark alley behind the town's shuttered movie theater, Shaggy and Scooby paced nervously beside a graffitied wall. Like Scoob, we're gonna end up on one of those missing posters, man, Shaggy whimpered, tugging his hoodie tighter. Scooby's nose twitched, catching a scent unfamiliar yet eerily sweet. Cotton candy mixed with something metallic. A red balloon floated lazily toward them from the shadows, stopping inches from their faces. "Raw!" Scooby whimpered. A soft giggle echoed around them, childish yet distorted. Shaggy grabbed Scooby's paw. "Don't look back, don't look back, don't look ba." A blur moved behind them, whispering, "Do you want to float too?" They bolted, crashing into trash cans and slipping on puddles, running until the echo of laughter was drowned out by their panicked screams. Back at the hotel, Thelma pieced together evidence on a wall covered in newspaper clippings, string, and crime scene photos. Her glasses slid down as she muttered, "Every child was seen speaking to someone named Bob Gray. That's one of Pennywise's aliases in the original accounts." Just then, a static-laced voicemail began playing on her laptop. It was from a local historian she had interviewed earlier that day. "Velma, listen. The clown. It's not a ghost or a man in a suit. It's ancient. It feeds on fear. That's why the kids see balloons. That's why the adults forget. It makes them forget." The call cut off with a guttural scream and the sound of a balloon popping. Velma stared in frozen silence, then whispered, "He's already watching us." Later that evening, the gang regrouped at Derry's old iron foundry, the last known location of a missing child. The air was thick with rust and decay. Fred took lead, flashlight in one hand and the journal in the other. Daphne clung to a broken pipe as she balanced across a narrow ledge. Below, Velma spotted something shimmering in a puddle, a child's shoe. Guys, he was here. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered, one by one, until only darkness remained. A projection began playing against the iron wall, home videos of laughing children, each fading into static as a red balloon filled the screen. A voice echoed, "They all float down here." The gang turned in horror. At the far end of the foundry stood a figure, half shadow, half smile, eyes glowing like dying stars. As they backed away, the floor beneath them cracked. From below, dozens of ghostly hands reached upward, not to grab, but to point. Velma gasped, "They're showing us something." Below the floor was a chamber, a theater of memories, with relics from each victim. Toys, drawings, shoes, broken glasses. In the center sat a massive circus throng, empty, but still warm. "He's not just haunting Derry," Fred said, his voice hollow. "He's nesting." Above them, the laughter returned, louder this time, and layered, like every child was laughing through him. Just before the lights returned, a voice whispered in their ears, "Next time, it's one of you." The heavy rain painted the Seoul skyline in streaks of silver as Haejin stood outside the glass lobby of J Group, a soaked umbrella discarded beside her. She had waited 3 hours, hoping Junho would descend those marble steps and see her again. Her resignation letter remained unread, her messages unanswered. Everything around her moved in slow motion, as if the world was punishing her silence with silence. Yet, deep inside, she knew Junho wasn't hiding. He was retreating, wounded by the same love that once gave him hope. But Haejin wasn't leaving without a fight, not again. She clenched the envelope in her hand, her eyes burning with tears and rain. Something had changed in her. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about courage and love. And just then, she heard the doors behind her creak open. Junho had been watching her from the shadows of the executive floor, torn between CEO instinct and human longing. Every day since their last encounter felt like torture reading her words, but feeling her absence louder. Her confession had pierced through years of armor, yet he feared one thing more than betrayal, losing her. And now, there she was drenched, stubborn and radiant in her pain. As he approached, the noise of the city drowned beneath the pounding of his own heart. "Why did you come back?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Haejin turned to face him, her lips trembling. "Because you never asked me to leave," she whispered, and the world seemed to pause between them, waiting for one of them to fall. They took shelter under the awning, both shivering from the storm and from everything unspoken. Junho stared at her hands, how they shook not from cold, but from restraint. "I thought letting you go would protect you," he confessed. "But it only destroyed me." Haejin looked at him with defiance and sorrow all at once. "You don't get to decide what breaks me, Junho. I'm not glass." Her words echoed between them, a declaration and a plea. He stepped closer, each step crushing his fear. "Then let me stop running. From the company, from the pain, from you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with promise. But before she could speak, a black car screeched to a halt beside them. The door opened and out stepped Chairman Jang, Junho's father, holding an umbrella over his own head as if immune to the storm. "So this is what you've become," he said coldly, eyes darting from his son to Haejin, paralyzed by his secretary's tears. Junho moved instinctively in front of her. "She's not my secretary. She's the woman I love." It wasn't rebellion, it was truth. The chairman laughed, bitter and cruel. "And you think that love will save this company? She's the scandal you'll never recover from." Haejin raised her chin, no longer afraid. "Then let the world know the truth, sir. That love exists even in the coldest towers." A gust of wind tore through the alley, but none of them flinched. Junho took Haejin's hand, firm and visible. "If I lose the company but keep her, I win. But if I keep the company and lose her, I lose everything." His father stared at him in stunned silence, then turned away, disappearing into the rain without another word. For a moment, the city fell quiet. Haejin squeezed Junho's hand, her tears mixing with the storm. "So what now?" she asked. Junho pulled her closer, forehead resting against hers. "Now we rebuild together." And for the first time in years, the rain felt like a blessing, not a burden. The first rays of the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the CEO's private office. Everything was quiet, too quiet for a company that had just survived a corporate coup, a media scandal, and a family war. Ji-hoon stood behind his desk, staring out over the city skyline, the weight of every recent decision still pressing heavily on his chest. He was no longer just a powerful CEO or a misunderstood son. He had become something far more fragile and far more human. The silence was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Hana. She didn't say a word. She simply walked in and closed the door behind her, her expression unreadable. "I thought you left after the board meeting," Ji-hoon said quietly, not turning around. "I almost did," she replied. "But something told me I should come back." He turned to face her, and for a moment, they both simply looked at each other. No accusations, no pride, just two people who had survived a storm together. "I don't know how to apologize for everything," Ji-hoon finally said, voice heavy. "I tried to protect you from my world, but I ended up pulling you into it." "You didn't pull me, Ji-hoon," Hana said, walking closer. "I chose to stay, even when it hurt. Because I believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself." The tension that had plagued their relationship began to loosen, melting away in the sincerity of the moment. Ji-hoon reached for her hand, slowly, as if afraid she would pull away. But she didn't, her fingers laced with his, and the office no longer felt like a battlefield. "We lost people," she whispered. "Your father, the investors, even your brother. But we didn't lose ourselves." Ji-hoon nodded. "And maybe that's enough to start over. Not just with the company, with us." Months passed. The company's reputation had been restored. Under Ji-hoon's leadership, and with Hana, now officially the director of corporate ethics, they implemented reforms that made headlines. No longer known as just a cold business empire, Ji-hoon's company had become a symbol of resilience, humanity, and responsibility. But it wasn't just the company that had changed. Ji-hoon himself was different, softer in his tone, more present. He smiled more. He listened. He loved. One spring afternoon, the company announced its annual gala would be held not in a luxury hotel, but in a local charity center raising funds for single mothers in tech. When Ji-hoon and Hana stepped onto the stage together, the applause was thunderous. But the crowd didn't know what was about to happen. Ji-hoon took the microphone and paused, scanning the room, before turning toward Hana. "Before we end tonight, there's something I've been meaning to do for a while." Gasps spread as Ji-hoon pulled a small box from his jacket. The room held its breath. "Hana Yoon," he said, kneeling before her, "you walked into my life and tore down every wall I built. You didn't just teach me love, you taught me courage. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Hana's eyes, and she covered her mouth in shock. The silence was deafening until she whispered, "Yes." The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed. But for Ji-hoon and Hana, there was only each other. No empire, no business, no expectations. Just two people who had survived betrayal, grief, and ambition, and found something rare and unbreakable between them. Their wedding was small, away from the media, on the edge of the ocean. Only a handful of close friends and staff were invited. Ji-hoon's mother, now reconciled with her son, placed a single white rose on the empty chair meant for his late father. It was not perfect, but it was peace. And as Ji-hoon and Hana said their vows under the orange-pink sky, the future no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a promise they would keep together.